On an apparently calm afternoon, the city of Jackson never imagined that injustice was about to manifest in a brutal way. What seemed like an ordinary day turned into a game of fate between two men, where cruelty and inequality would be exposed. In an unforgiving manner, stay until the end to see how this story turns everything upside down. Alan O'Brien, a 25-year-old white police officer, was carrying out his shift with a mixture of arrogance and an unjustifiable sense of superiority. He walked the streets with a cold and calculating look, not knowing that this routine patrol would take an unexpected turn. When he saw Mateus, a 33-year-old black man, walking calmly through the streets of a predominantly African-American neighborhood, something inside Alan clicked. There was no reason, there was no justification, but the color of Mateus's skin was enough to trigger the prejudice machine. What seemed like just another day for Alan would soon become a shameful spectacle of humiliation. He approached Mateus with a look that overflowed with suspicion, as if that simple act of walking there was reason for an investigation. And the worst, he didn't think twice before treating Matthew with unbearable contempt. "What are you doing here? You don't belong here." These words echoed through the air, filled with veiled and suffocating racism, but Alan didn't know what was about to happen. He didn't know he was about to make the worst choice of his life. Hatred disguised as authority overflowed from every word Alan spoke, and his every gesture exuded a desire to humiliate and demean. He thought he was in control, believing that his position and skin color gave him the right to bend others to his will. But what Alan didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that at the very moment he was looking at Matthew with contempt, he was, without realizing it, digging his own professional and personal grave. What Alan saw was just another black man in his path, an easy target for his arrogance and prejudice, a young man whom he could bully without consequence. But the truth that Alan ignored was right before his eyes. Mateus was not just another victim of structural racism, like so many others. He wasn't the vulnerable, silent and submissive stereotype that Alan wanted to see. Matthew was something much bigger. He was the silent force of change that was about to transform everything Alan knew. Every harsh word Alan spoke, every dismissive gesture he made, was fueling the fire of Matthew's determination, a fire that would soon be impossible to ignore. While Alan was obsessed with showing off his power, he didn't realize that true power was actually in the hands of those he underestimated. He was creating his own downfall without even knowing it. And the irony? The story unfolding before him was about to put everything he thought he knew about authority, privilege, and power to the test. What Alan would never have imagined, but what Matthew knew from the beginning, was that he was about to be relentlessly confronted by the very arrogance that fueled his distorted view of the world. There was no reason, there was no justification, but Alan didn't need any of that. The 25-year-old white police officer simply felt it was time to act, to bring order where he thought there was disorder. For no legitimate reason, he decides to stop Mateus, a 33-year-old black man who was walking calmly through the streets of a neighborhood that Alan never seemed to understand. The moment their eyes met, something in Alan's mind clicked. What he didn't know was that his narrow-minded, racist outlook was about to trigger a series of events he couldn't control. With a sudden movement, Alan approaches Mateus. His tone of voice is already full of contempt. He begins to interrogate the young man aggressively, as if he were a criminal on the run, without even knowing who he was or what he was doing there. There was no reason to do so, but Alan felt he needed to reassert his authority. He believed with absurd confidence that his aggressive stance and arrogance were all he needed to maintain control. The truth? Not only was he being reckless, he was also acting in a deeply racist manner. If this happened to you, how would you react? Write in the comments. With disconcerting coldness, Alan tries to intimidate Mateus. His words cut through the air like sharp knives loaded with judgment and disdain. He assumes a posture of superiority, convinced that as a white police officer, he had the right to do anything, including disrespecting someone based solely on the color of their skin. He doesn't realize the gravity of his attitude, nor how cruel he was being at that moment. Alan doesn't understand that he was overflowing with disgusting arrogance and a distorted idea of power that only fueled the cycle of hatred and discrimination. As Alan loses himself in his charade of authority, he begins to throw derogatory comments towards Matthew, as if he is debunking something that doesn't exist. He questions the young man's origins, tries to disqualify him based on the color of his skin, assuming that someone with that skin tone would not have the right to be there in that neighborhood, in that space, as if he were an intruder. He doesn't care about Mateus's explanations, about the calm and dignity that the young man carries when trying to answer. Nothing Matthew says seems to matter. Alan is so immersed in his distorted view of the world, so dominated by the idea of superiority, that the simple fact that a black man was there in that place was enough for him to act as if he owned everything. And do you think the police officer acted correctly or exaggerated? Comment yes or no. The tension grows by the second, the air charged with hostility and injustice. With each word thrown by Alan, Mateus, without losing his composure, tries to remain calm, trying to explain his presence in a logical and rational way, but none of this reaches Alan. For him, Matthew is no longer a human being, he is just an easy target for his demonstration of power. Alan, so immersed in his own arrogance, can't see what he's doing. He is so consumed by the idea that his skin color and uniform give him absolute power that he ignores the fact that he is merely perpetuating violence disguised as authority. Mateus, with unshakable dignity, feels the weight of humiliation, but does not give in. He knows he is being subjected to grotesque prejudice, but he still doesn't lose his composure. He knows that despite Alan's cruelty, what matters is his reaction. He remains calm, knowing that this moment, this abuse of power, will not define who he is. But for Alan, this moment will be the beginning of something he is not prepared to face. Because, as he tries to put Matthew down, he has no idea that what he is doing is much bigger than he realizes. He is digging his own grave, and the end of this story will be a bitter lesson for him. After the public humiliation, Mateus turns around and starts walking towards the end of the street. He feels the weight of contempt, the pain of being treated as inferior, but he does not show weakness. With firm steps, he maintains an erect posture, his appearance serene. But before he walks away completely, he stops for a moment and gives Alan a deep look, a look that could have knocked any man down. It wasn't just a look of anger, but one of frightening calm, as if in that moment Mateus knew something that Alan still couldn't understand. It was as if he knew that that moment of humiliation, that abuse of power, would not go unpunished. What Alan didn't know, what he could never imagine, is that Mateus wasn't just another black man walking the streets of a lower-class neighborhood. Mateus, with his calm demeanor and dignified posture, was much more than that. He wasn't just someone trying to go unnoticed or protect himself from the wounds the world threw at him. In fact, Mateus was about to take on one of the most important positions at the local police station. He was about to become Alan's boss, someone with the power to supervise, command, and yes, repay every ounce of humiliation he had suffered. The look in Matthew's eyes said it all. He knew the turning point was coming, and Alan would be the last to realize what was about to happen. A few weeks passed, and Alan's routine at the police station continued without any major surprises, until something unexpected arrived. He entered the office as usual, when an official announcement was read, a restructuring at the police station, and Mateus, that young man whom he had so cruelly humiliated, was promoted to a high leadership position with the responsibility of supervising the entire team, including Alan. Alan, still wrapped in his bubble of superiority, couldn't hide his disbelief. His stomach turned. He who had always considered himself at the top of the chain, who thought he was untouchable, would now see the man he disrespected and belittled promoted to a position of absolute power. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. His gaze swept around the room, trying to comprehend what was happening, as the weight of the situation slowly settled in his chest. The same young man he treated with contempt now had the authority to decide his fate. Alan, unknowingly, had sown the seeds of his own downfall, and that was the great irony. Alan's hatred and prejudice would take him to a place he never imagined. When Alan was informed about Matthew's promotion, something inside him broke. He didn't know if the surprise was greater than the shame that was beginning to rise within him. He, who always thought he was superior, would now have to face reality. He, the white middle-class police officer, would have to answer to a black man, whom he had humiliated for no reason, who now held the power to command him. The shock was like an electrical shock to his body. He never imagined that this young man, whom he had so contemptuously underestimated, would become his boss. What Alan couldn't process was that his arrogance and racism had been not just a mistake, but a brutal lesson that the power to humiliate and disrespect someone didn't come without consequences. He was being confronted with a harsh reality. A man he thought would never amount to anything, who he had disregarded based on his skin color, now had absolute power over him. Alan felt the humiliation begin to reverse, and for the first time, he had to face the fact that his own downfall was being orchestrated by his ignorance, and the irony was cruel. Alan never understood that Matthew's true strength lay not just in his competence, but in his ability to remain calm in the face of such humiliation. He thought he had won, but Matthew's greatest victory was actually the lesson that true dignity and power come from silent resistance in the face of injustice. And now Alan was about to learn the hard way, without any reason, without a plausible explanation. Alan simply decides it was time to act. It doesn't matter who Matthew was. It doesn't matter what he was doing there. For Alan, a 25-year-old white police officer, the color of Mateus's skin was enough to justify a grotesque abuse of power. He approaches aggressively, like a predator in search of its prey, and begins to interrogate the young man with a brutality that borders on the surreal. With every word, with every movement, Alan tried to intimidate, to force a submission that he felt was rightfully his. "What are you doing here? It's not your place." His words were filled with contempt, as if Mateus were just an intruder in a space where he, Alan, saw himself as the undisputed authority. He assumed an aggressive stance, as if he felt he was in control of the situation, without realizing that his attitude was not just reckless. It was a clear and indisputable act of racism. But worst of all, he had no idea how far his arrogance would take him. He believed his uniform and his skin color were all he needed to intimidate and humiliate. Deep down, he thought he was in control, that his superiority was assured. He didn't realize that every word that came out of his mouth, every harsh gesture, was digging his own grave, not immediately, but in the future, when the truth would come out in a devastating way. Alan didn't know that the moment he chose to humiliate Matthew, he was about to start a power play that he wasn't ready to lose. He didn't know that the young man he so openly despised would soon become the man who would ruin everything for him. Alan's ignorance and arrogance were not just a flaw, but a fatal error. The abuse of power, which seemed harmless at the time, was about to trigger a twist that no one, including Alan, had ever imagined. The turn of events was a bitter lesson, one Alan never imagined he would have to face. In his narrow and prejudiced vision, what seemed to be just another moment of control over someone he considered inferior turned into a brutal confrontation with reality. Alan never imagined that the young black man he so openly and mercilessly humiliated would now be responsible for his professional future. The idea that Matthew, the man he treated as nothing more than an interloper, was now his boss seems like a blow too cruel for him to comprehend. As Alan tried to deal with the humiliation he had caused himself, he found himself face to face with the reflection of his own failures. He never realized that a man's true greatness is not measured by the color of his skin or the position a police uniform gives him. Matthew's story, which was just beginning, was a true cry of resistance against the invisible forces of discrimination. Irrefutable proof that the rise of a human being is not determined by the color of their skin, but by their competence, their courage to move forward, and, above all, by their unshakable dignity. As Alan digested the bitter reality that his arrogance had been his own worst enemy, he was forced to face an uncomfortable truth. Matthew's ability lay not in his color, but in his resilience, in his ability to overcome all the obstacles that society imposed on him. And the worst thing for Alan is that Mateus, unlike him, never needed to humiliate or degrade anyone to be great. True justice, he learned the hard way, lies not in the temporary power that a position or uniform gives you, but in the ability to rise up in the face of injustice. Matthew's story is much more than a simple tale of personal overcoming. It is a cry against the inequalities still prevalent in many institutions, a powerful denunciation of how racism still permeates people's daily lives, often in a veiled and insidious way. Alan, in his ignorance, barely realized that the racism he perpetuated was not something explicit, but something deep and silent, which infiltrated daily interactions and which, most of the time, was not even recognized by those who practiced it. But Matthew knew. He knew his fight wouldn't be easy, but his rise to the top of the police hierarchy wasn't just about reaching a position of power. It was about breaking down barriers that should never have existed. Mateus's real struggle was not in his professional advancement, but in his daily resistance against veiled discrimination, in the microaggressions he faced throughout his life, and even more so in his ability to not bow down to them. He did not allow the racism that still exists in society's power structures to bring him down. He didn't let the contempt of people like Alan define his worth. Matthew's story is a painful but essential reminder that true justice is not measured by the power one wields, but by the ability to reverse the harm caused by discrimination and by giving others the opportunity to prove themselves, regardless of their color. What Mateus achieved was more than a promotion. He earned the right to be treated with the dignity and respect he always deserved, and in doing so, he not only defeated an unjust system, but also challenged the power structure that still tries to demean those who are considered inferior. He is a symbol that, no matter how much racism still tries to infiltrate the shadows of society, the resistance and courage of individuals like him can indeed reverse these injustices and show that the future, in the end, belongs to those who refuse to be silenced. Alan O'Brien's future was irreversibly changed after that fateful meeting. The arrogant police officer, who until then thought he was invulnerable, had his life turned upside down by his own ignorance. Alan always believed that his skin color, his uniform, and his position as a police officer gave him the freedom to act as he wanted without repercussions. But what he didn't know was that the abuse of power he had exercised against Mateus would not go unpunished. Life has a relentless way of reversing roles when you least expect it. And that's exactly what happened. After Matthew's promotion, Alan was forced to deal with the reality that true authority does not come from the color of one's skin or the position held, but from the dignity and respect one gains from treating others humanely. His arrogance was his biggest mistake, and by trying to humiliate a man he thought inferior, Alan not only destroyed the relationship he could have had with a colleague, but also dug his own professional grave. The impact was devastating. He could no longer look at his own image in the mirror without feeling the shame that accompanied it. The weeks that followed were marked by a growing feeling of helplessness. That power he was proud to have now turned into an unbearable weight. Every time I looked at Mateus, I no longer saw just any young man, but a symbol of everything he had lost through his narrow vision. Alan began to live under the constant reminder that his disrespectful attitude was a shot in the foot, and that now he would have to submit to the authority of someone he considered inferior just because of the color of his skin. The humiliation Alan inflicted on Mateus came back to him in a way that was as painful as it was unavoidable. It served as a brutal reminder that the contempt one shows toward another human being is never without consequence. The harsh truth was that Alan's cruel actions were never isolated. They were seeds of destruction that would eventually grow into a storm that would topple everything he held dear. The power he thought he wielded so confidently, the authority he assumed came with the privilege of his skin and position, was fragile, built on a foundation of lies and misconceptions. And now the weight of those lies had come crashing down on him. The consequences of his actions had arrived, and they were far heavier than he could have ever imagined, dismantling his pride, his career, and his false sense of invincibility. The sting of reality hit Alan harder than any confrontation he could have ever prepared for. His arrogance had been his downfall. He had never considered that the very man he had tried to demean and control would one day hold the power to shape his future. The universe, in its own way, had delivered a lesson of undeniable fairness, that no one, no matter how powerful or privileged they may seem, is immune to the repercussions of cruelty. It's a cruel irony that Alan, in his blind pursuit of superiority, had brought about the very consequences he sought to avoid. In the end, it was his own prejudices that stripped him of everything he thought he had earned. For Mateus, however, the promotion wasn't just a career milestone, it was the culmination of a lifetime of overcoming adversity and fighting back against the systemic prejudice that had tried to define him. Growing up in a neighborhood where the weight of discrimination was an unspoken, ever-present force, was a battle he had been fighting since childhood. Every step Mateus took, every opportunity he seized, was met with resistance, not because of his character, but because of the color of his skin. The world had tried to impose limits on him, to reduce him to a stereotype, to define him by the walls of the society he lived in. Yet, despite the constant setbacks and the daily grind of injustice, Mateus never allowed those obstacles to define him. Instead, he used each challenge, every attempt to silence him, as fuel for his fire. Every act of prejudice became a stepping stone, not a stumbling block. He didn't allow their hatred to weaken him. He allowed it to strengthen him. Each struggle, every moment of adversity, shaped him into the man he was today, a man not only capable of rising above, but destined to thrive despite the obstacles. His promotion wasn't just a professional triumph, it was a symbol of his resilience, a resounding proof that despite all the forces stacked against him, he had prevailed. This victory was a testament to his strength, to the enduring power of his spirit, and to the unshakable truth that dignity and respect are earned not by conformity, but by standing tall against the odds. When he found out about the promotion, he didn't just feel the satisfaction of a job well done. He felt a deeper sense that his rise was not just about him, but about all those who, throughout history, have faced the same kind of prejudice, violence, and humiliation. Matthew's every achievement was not only personal, but a victory against the system that constantly tried to put him in the background. His victory was the victory of all who refused to submit to the limitations imposed by a society that still looks at the color of your skin before recognizing your value. When Alan was forced to recognize Matthew's power, what he was seeing wasn't just a new boss on the job. He was seeing a man who had risen against the odds, someone who refused to be defined by anyone but himself. Mateus's trajectory became a symbol of resistance and justice, reminding everyone that even in the face of the greatest injustice, courage and competence can break the chains of discrimination. His success was living proof that true greatness does not lie in humiliating others, but in overcoming one's own challenges with dignity and strength. And more than that, he proved to everyone, especially Alan, that true power is not that which is imposed by force or prejudice, but that which is born from the ability to transform adversity into victory. Matthew's ascension was a devastating reminder for everyone. Injustice may try to crush someone's spirit, but it will never be able to erase the strength that resides in those who refuse to surrender. The story of Alan and Mateus is a lesson that everyone should hear, a reminder that injustice and racism, no matter how deeply rooted in society, can and should be challenged. But what is most shocking about this story is not just the humiliation suffered by Mateus or the young man's rise against all expectations, but the fact that those who abuse their power, like Alan, never know when the tables will be turned against them. What seemed like an ordinary day in Alan's life, with him exercising his authority without thinking about the consequences, turned into a devastating blow to his ego and his career. The twist that everyone needs to see is this: those who believe themselves to be untouchable, who wield their power and the privilege of their skin color to dominate and humiliate others, are blind to the profound and irreversible consequences their actions can have on the future. Life, as if it were an impartial and unyielding force, has a way of returning exactly what was sown, whether that return is immediate or delayed, whether it comes in a form the perpetrator expects or not. What Alan could never have anticipated in his moment of arrogance was that the young man he so viciously humiliated, the man he thought was beneath him, would not only rise above the injustice, but would become the very key to his own professional and personal downfall. In that critical instant, Alan was consumed by his own sense of superiority, blind to the fact that the world does not operate on the simple terms of power and dominance that he so arrogantly assumed. What he failed to see was that the true fight for justice and equality is not only against overt, explicit racism, the kind that is loud and obvious, but also against the subtler, more insidious forms of discrimination that manifest in everyday actions, in moments when people like Alan think no one is watching. It's in the dismissive gestures, the casual assumptions, the offhand comments, the subtle exclusion. These small acts of bias may seem insignificant in isolation, but when accumulated, they become a powerful force that can change the course of lives, shaping a future that is full of consequences for those who fail to recognize their impact. These everyday acts of veiled discrimination carry consequences that can become relentless and unyielding, just as Alan would soon discover. The truth is, those who think they can exercise power without accountability are often blind to the long-term effects of their actions. They believe they can get away with it because they feel invincible, but life has a way of correcting the balance. For Alan, the very man he sought to oppress would be the catalyst for his fall from grace, a stark reminder that injustice never goes unchallenged, and that the seeds of disrespect and cruelty always find a way to come back and haunt their creator. What began as an act of thoughtless, discriminatory aggression would ultimately become the source of Alan's reckoning, teaching him, albeit too late, that the true cost of racism is often paid in ways one never expects. Alan and Mateus's journey is not just about a police officer and a young black man, but about a system of power that for a long time has tried to keep certain groups at the bottom of the social chain. It's a daily, silent struggle that many face, but few can visualize, until something happens to shake the system. Change begins when people like Alan begin to realize that prejudice and injustice are not just words in a dictionary, but realities that affect people's lives in devastating and painful ways. Have you ever seen something similar happen? Share your experience in the comments. But the most important thing is that real change doesn't simply occur in moments of crisis or major upheavals like the one Alan faced. It begins with something far simpler, yet far more profound: the ability to recognize the true humanity of another person. This recognition isn't just about acknowledging someone's existence, it's about seeing them for who they really are, beyond the stereotypes, beyond the labels society might place on them. When Alan was forced to face the undeniable truth that Mateus was not just another black guy on the block, but a man with his own story, his own struggles, his own achievements, he was struck with a gut-wrenching realization. This was a person who had worked hard for everything he had, who had fought against every possible obstacle life threw at him, and who, despite the world's unfairness, still stood with dignity. Alan finally understood that Mateus wasn't just a figure he could dismiss with his own prejudices. The weight of his own arrogance and ignorance bore down on him as he saw with brutal clarity the mistake he had made. He saw the years of injustice Mateus had faced, not just because of the color of his skin, but because people like Alan had the power to degrade, to belittle, to impose their own narrow worldview onto others. And now, in that moment, Alan realized that human dignity isn't something that can be claimed or taken away based on someone's race, background, or appearance. It transcends all prejudice, all assumptions about who someone should be or how they should behave. It hit him that true respect isn't about dominance or authority, but about recognizing the shared humanity we all carry. For Alan, this moment of self-realization would be a turning point in his life, but it came at a heavy cost. He had to confront his own demons, his own racism, and the damage it had already done. In that instant, Alan understood something crucial. Change begins not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in small, everyday acts of recognition, empathy, and respect. Therein lies the great lesson of history. The fight for justice and equality is still far from over. Racism and discrimination may not disappear once and for all, but change begins to happen when individuals begin to see themselves as equals. And that requires true reflection, a change of perspective. Alan and Matthew's story, marked by this shocking twist, reminds us that the power to destroy is strong, but the power to rebuild, to make a difference, is even more potent. When someone, like Matthew, refuses to submit to the system of oppression, and when truth and justice prevail, we see the birth of something powerful: real change. When the truth emerges, it is not easy to swallow. Change does not occur without suffering, without confrontation. But in the end, it is the truth that will break the chains that keep us tied to the past of discrimination. Matthew's ascension was not just a happy ending for him. It was a reminder to all of us that, however difficult it may be, the fight for equality and mutual respect is a battle worth fighting. And for those like Alan, who think they can play with fate and hide behind their privilege, this story shows that true justice is never fleeting. She will always find her way. Now that You know the full truth behind this surprising twist. We want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed something similar? What do you think about the abuse of power and the fight for justice? Leave your comment below. We want to hear your voice. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge the system and show how justice always finds its way. Activate the bell so you don't miss any of our impactful videos. Until next time.